For most of my young life, video games meant the PlayStation 1. That's what I grew up with. We never had the money for a PS2 and the PS3 was out of the question. So years later when I finally got my hands on a PS3, it was pure nostalgia. I went back, picked up the games I always wanted, but could never afford. One of those games was Dante's Inferno. I'd seen it when it came out in 2010. It had that big, edgy marketing push, people calling it EA's answer to God of War. It looked loud, brutal, and over the top. Since I never had the PS2 and I never played God of War back then, Dante's Inferno was something I'd always wanted to try. I finally played it. It took me about 7 hours to get through, and while I had fun with it, the game left with mixed feelings. But to really understand Dante's Inferno, you have to look at where it came from, how it was made, and the strange controversy around it. The game was made by Visceral Games, a studio under EA that had just released Dead Space in 2008. That game was a critical hit. It was a slow, claustrophobic horror set in space, and it put the studio on the map. EA wanted more, and instead of just letting Visceral stick to Dead Space, they split the team. Part of the studio made Dead Space 2, while another team built Dante's Inferno. The inspiration came from the Divine Comedy, a 14th century Italian poem by Dante Alighieri. The poem was huge in Western literature, often taught in schools, and maps out a journey through hell, purgatory, and paradise. Dante is guided by the poet Virgil, and together they pass through the 9 circles of hell, where each sin has its own punishment. Visceral decided to take that structure and turn it into an action game. But Dante isn't the poet here, he is a crusader who literally kills death and takes his scythe to fight his way through hell. He's trying to save Beatrice, his beloved who's been taken by Lucifer. The tone is completely different from the source material, but that was the pitch. A medieval poem reimagined as a hack and slash epic. Development started in the late 2000s, right after Dead Space. Jonathan Knight was the creative director. The team openly studied God of War, which was the benchmark for action games at that time. If you play Dante's Inferno, you can see it immediately. The scythe moves almost like Kratos' blades. The combat system, the air juggles, the big finishing move with button prompts, and it's all very familiar. Even the climbing sections and puzzles feel borrowed. But where God of War was drenched in Greek mythology, Dante's Inferno tried to set itself apart with Christian imagery. Instead of fighting minotaurs and hydras, you're fighting demons, damned souls, and monstrous interpretations of sin. EA clearly wanted a hit on the scale of God of War. And in some ways they pushed even harder. The marketing made sure of that. EA went all in on controversy. At E3 2009, people walking into the convention saw protesters outside holding signs that said things like, "Hell is not a game." It looked like a Christian protest against the game. Reporters covered it and the photos went online. Later, it turned out the protests weren't even real. EA had hired actors and everything was staged. When the truth came out, people weren't impressed. It felt very cheap and it turned into a PR headache. That wasn't the only stunt. There was a promotion called Sin to Win, where people could enter a contest to win prizes by doing things themed around the 7 deadly sins. One prize was literally called a Night of Sin with exotic dancers. That didn't go over well either, and EA had to walk it back. The marketing was aggressive and it kept the game in the headlines, but not always for the right reasons. When I finally sat down and played it years later, I could see what they were going for. It's short, I finished it in about 7 hours, and that's not unusual for this genre, but it felt like it still ended very quickly. The level design is where the disappointment hit the hardest. Each circle of hell is supposed to be distinct, like greed, gluttony, lust, heresy, but in the game the stages all start to blur together. Most of them look like variation of stone walls, fire and grotesque flesh. Only on the very last stage, with its frozen lake and Satan trapped in ice, it really stands out. The combat works, the scythe feels satisfying to swing, and you can level up either holy or unholy powers depending on how you judge the enemies. But the lack of variety hurts it. You only really have one weapon, and you don't get that excitement of unlocking new gear. Enemies repeat constantly. The same demon types come back again and again, just in bigger groups. Instead of ramping up tension through creativity, the game throws more of the same at you. The puzzles are another sore point. They're everywhere, but they're rarely clever. They feel like filler, pulling levers, pushing boxes, and basic platforming. They slow the game down without much reward. There are some interesting moments. The lore is one of them. Every boss ties into Dante's poem, each one representing a particular scene. The art direction leans into grotesque imagery that you don't usually see in mainstream games. And the 10 Rings challenge should have been a highlight, but in reality it just felt repetitive. The final boss fight against Satan doesn't land. It's short, it's anticlimactic, and it ends with a cliffhanger teasing a sequel that never happened. What I did like was the bonus content. The extras about Dante Alighieri's life and the original poem were fascinating. It made me want to go back and revisit the source material, and that's something I didn't expect from an EA action game. By the end I was glad I just played it, but I also knew I wouldn't come back to it. When it came out on February 2010, critics gave it a solid but glowing reviews. Most landed in the 7 out of 10 range. IGN said it was fun but too derivative. Eurogamer noted the lack of imagination in the levels, and GameSpot pointed out the short length and repetition. On Xbox 360, where God of War wasn't available, it did better. For players who didn't have Kratos, Dante filled the gap. But on PlayStation 3, the comparisons were brutal, and Datne didn't measure up. Because of the theme, the game drew more controversy. Religious groups criticized it for trivializing hell. Scholars rolled their eyes at how far it strayed from Dante's poem. In the original poem, Dante is a poet, guided through hell, observing and reflecting. In the game, Dante is a crusader in armor, mowing down enemies with a scythe. It's a massive reinterpretation. Some people thought it was bold, others thought it was disrespectful. Most just thought it was a missed opportunity to do something more thoughtful with the source material. The game ends on a cliffhanger, clearly pointing towards Purgatorio. The plan was obvious, build a trilogy, Hell, Purgatory and Paradise, but it never happened. Sales were fine but not amazing, around 1.5 million copies sold. Respectable but not enough for a blockbuster franchise. God of War owned the genre, and Dante's Inferno couldn't escape its shadow. Visceral Games also shifted focus. They went back to Dead Space and made 2 sequels, and by 2017, EA shut down the studio entirely. Whatever plans there were for Purgatorio or Paradiso died there. So how does Dante Inferno look today? It's remembered mostly as that God of War clone set in Hell, and that's fair, it copies a lot, but it doesn't reinvent much. But it's also a snapshot of EA in the late 2000s. They were chasing trends, they wanted their own God of War, their own Call of Duty. Sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. Dante's Inferno sits in that middle ground, ambitious enough to get noticed, but not original enough to last. For me, finally playing it after all these years, it was worth the experience. The combat was fun enough to carry me through 7 hours, and the lore and the art direction had moments that grabbed me. The extras about Dante Alighieri were a nice surprise. But the flaws were hard to ignore, the repetition, the lack of variety, the boring puzzles, and the underwhelming final boss. I finished it, I enjoyed it, and I put it down knowing I'd never come back again. Dante's Inferno was a bold idea, a medieval poem reimagined as a brutal action game. It had solid combat, memorable imagery, and a few flashes of brilliance. but it also leaned too heavy on other series and repeated itself too often. It actually never lived up to the potential of its premise. In the end, it's a one-off. Not a franchise starter, not a classic, but rather a curiosity. A game that made noise in 2010, sparked debate, and then faded away. For players like me who missed out on God of War during the PlayStation 2 days, it offered a taste of that style of a game. But it also showed how hard it is to follow on someone else's footsteps.